What are the top 3 things you need to think about when choosing your first programming language? Let's talk about it. Number 1, what kinds of things do you want to build? There's all kinds of reasons that people give for choosing different programming languages. To name one would be like performance. Somebody might say C is so much faster than some other language. In the beginning, forget about all that kind of stuff. Let's think about what do you want to build and what's going to get you there the quickest. So for example, if you want to build something like a web application, Ruby on Rails, NodeJS, those are things out of the box that are going to make your life way easier than if you choose something like Java. Now, Java is a good language to learn later if you want to go work in the corporate world, or there's a number of other reasons. But in the beginning, you want to choose something that's very, very conducive to the things that you want to do. For example, if you want to do data science, you should absolutely choose Python. Now, if you do data science, you have other issues to worry about. You need to know a lot more math than if you want to do web application development. So you can't just naively say, oh, I think I want to be a data scientist, so I'm going to jump straight in. You need a pretty sophisticated mathematical background to really get into data science. And so I tend to encourage people, like, if that's you, that's great. If it's not, if you're coming from more of a place of, I use this app and I thought it was cool and I think coding is the future and so on and so forth, you really should choose something like JavaScript or Ruby. That's my ultimate recommendation. But again, start with what you want to make, because if you know that you want to make games, maybe Ruby isn't the best choice. Maybe you do need to go down the rabbit hole of something more difficult like C++ or something lower level. But again, that's up to you, but it's important to start with the what do you want to make conversation. And I think that that's super important and often neglected, because it's important to know, like, what inspired you to get into this in the first place. Now, it could be money and finances, that's a real thing. But, if you just need to make money, there's arguably easier things to do than learn to program. That's probably not a popular opinion, but for example, you could go learn Facebook marketing and sell services to, small businesses in your area. That might be easier. Programming is not necessarily an endeavor you embark on simply because you want to make money. Ultimately, you need to have something at your core driving you that's like, I want to make things. And that's why we call this channel Tech Maker, is because we're oriented around the idea of, what do we want to make? How do we do it? Like how do we bring, some complicated idea into the smallest number of simple steps and actually build it? So if you ever go through one of our series, ultimately what we're trying to do is to say, how do you go from not knowing something to being able to make something as quickly as possible? So that's really the first thing I would say is, what do you want to make? Number 2, how easy is it to get started? Whenever you're learning a language, you're going to be looking at videos, tutorials, books potentially, any number of resources, and you need to develop a sense for, like, when is this a little bit too hard? And, I say that because some languages are dramatically easier to get started with than others. So for example, I am a big fan of Ruby. I think Ruby is probably the best language if you don't have, unless you're trying to do something super specific, like I mentioned a minute ago with game development or data science or something like that. If you're just wanting to learn a general purpose language so that you can do some kind of development in the web or apps and you're not 100% sure, I think Ruby is definitely the way to go for like the first 6 months. And the reason I say that is because the community and the ecosystem is super friendly. The frameworks are incredibly well developed and documented. It's very readable. The programming language it's stated that it was designed for programmer happiness, as they say. So it's definitely has my vote as far as like the easiest one to kind of get into and immerse yourself in. Now that said, there are other very reasonable choices, and like JavaScript isn't a bad choice. JavaScript has a level of difficulty around. There's a bajillion different frameworks now and libraries, and it's a little hard to navigate that. You get sort of hit with this like, I guess they call it like the paradox of choice. There's a billion things you could do, and it's, should you do Angular or React or fill in the blank? I don't really keep up with all the latest ones, but that's certainly a challenge when you have tons of options. So that's one thing to consider with JavaScript. That's just kind of an aside. But back to the point is like when you're learning, you need to evaluate again from point number one, what do you want to make, and then as you're going through tutorials, how close are you to that thing? So for example, and I'll link to this in the description, but David Hansen, if I'm saying that properly, DHH for short, when he invented Ruby on Rails, when he created it, he made this video of how to build a blog in 10 minutes. And there's a YouTube video, which again I'll link to. But that's kind of incredible. So instead of spending days toiling through configuration in something like Java, you could be up and running in 10 minutes and have a blog. And I think if you want to build web applications, that's very meaningful. That's a very useful starting point. It's to be able to say like, hey, I knew nothing, and now whatever it is for a brand new beginner, maybe 3 hours later, like I can actually build a blog and people can sign in and they can post blog posts, and maybe a few more hours later you put it out on the web. And so like that's kind of what I'm saying around this, like how easy is it to actually get toward what you're trying to get to. So it's a little bit of a hard thing to evaluate because if you're really a true beginner, everything's going to feel a little bit hard. So I mean the 10-minute blog thing is useful as a rubric because like if you're doing something over here in another language and it's taking you 12 days to try to set up a basic blog and connect to the database and whatever, yeah, that's probably not the best route. So again, like with something like game development or data science, I mean, there's going to be more technical overhead. So you kind of have to prepare yourself for that. But, I would say like this. Probably the best way, I'm always a big fan of breaking things down. Take a big problem, break it into small pieces. I mean, that's the only way to get through any of this stuff. So I'd say, let's say you want to do data science. Make a list of all the languages where, that are common in the world of data science. Like, don't try to squeeze data science into something else necessarily. I mean, I actually have a series we're working on how to do like data science in Ruby with Python via like a Python, connection. But I would say in the beginning, just say like, let's say you're doing data science. Let's get back to the point here. So Python, MATLAB, R, I think there's another one, SAS, something like that. It's been a while, so mostly just do Python. So whatever the list is, make that list and then investigate each one. Like how many tutorials can I find? Go to sites like lynda.com, which I'll link to in the description. Probably one of the best resources for learning new languages. I still use it to this day, and I've been doing this for about 10 years, so it's literally the best resource for just quickly picking up languages and things. So I'll link to that. But yeah, so go to sites like that and see like how many courses are there? Are there any? And then pick the ones where there's a lot. I mean, that sounds kind of obvious, and it is kind of obvious, but I think people get stuck in this. There's all sorts of reasons people give, as I said earlier, for like why you should use this language or that language. And if you want to actually be successful, you need to remove as many barriers as possible. And one of the barriers is going to be you're working through a problem, you're stuck, and there's nobody to help you. So you want to choose situations where there's tons and tons and tons of resources available. And there are plenty of communities like that. So that is number 2. Make sure that you're doing the thing that is the easiest. Number 3 for my European friends, where do you want to work? And specifically, like what kind of environment do you want to work in? Now this may be a more relevant question for your second language, but it's something that you should start thinking about now. So for example, you could make all kinds of choices on a couple of different spectrums here. So you might say like, I want to work in very early stage startups. I want to work in late stage startups, anywhere in that gap in the middle. You might want to work for big corporations. You might want to work for small businesses. You might want to be a freelancer. You might want to start your own startup. There's a ton of choices here. And so the really important thing to think through is like, in any given context, like what's the most common thing? Now, again, remember, this is point number 3. So I wouldn't necessarily make this the primary point of consideration, but it is something to research. So there's a few different ways you can go about this. So if you want to work in big companies, so make a list of companies that you'd like to work for, and then go on some site like Indeed or LinkedIn and find job descriptions and see like what is the most common thing. And remember to filter through like how easy is it, like, those, what do you want to make, those sort of things, right? So like, if you go look at big corporations, you're going to find a lot of Java. You will find some Ruby. You'll find some JavaScript. So, just because it's a big company doesn't necessarily rule out some of the things we were talking about earlier, but it may add another layer of consideration where you might spend a few months learning one thing and then you want to switch to this other thing because it's way more common. If you want to go into startups, a really good suggestion, in my opinion, would be go look on AngelList and see what people are doing at different stages. You'll find out probably, if I'm guessing, I haven't looked super recently, but you probably find a lot more JavaScript. Potentially some other languages like Go or Elixir or things like that. I think Elixir is probably a lot less common. But it'll give you a sense of like, okay, if you're a person who wants to start a new project, you want to make a good choice around what you want to build it with, because if you end up raising money or maybe just getting success in any particular way, you might want to hire somebody. And how easy is it to hire somebody who's skilled in that particular language? Now, all the stuff we've talked about so far is, of course, you're going to be able to find people. Ruby, there's tons of Ruby developers. I think the one thing that I would say is like for freelancers, freelancing is a little bit of a different dynamic. So I worked as a freelancer for a long time with Ruby on Rails. It's a very doable thing. The more a language matures, it seems to me, and again, like I'm not saying you couldn't become a Ruby on Rails freelancer today, you certainly could, but I think you have to have a higher level of understanding to do it, or really good marketing skills, one of the two, which maybe both, to be frank. But the thing is, like, the more a skill becomes common, the more companies are going to hire internally for just like core competency, kind of having developers and stuff. If you're like a performance expert with Ruby on Rails, that may give you more opportunities than, say, just being a good developer. If you're just a good developer, it's going to be easier probably to find a job. Again, like I could be wrong in some sense on this in certain contexts. I mean, I've been doing freelancing for a long time. I have clients, but I think there's definitely a dynamic which is like there's a lot more job offers for really good salaries than there are clients posting really credible job listings anymore. Like that's just something that I've noticed. So that's something to keep in mind. But anyway, the point is like you want to find a way to kind of really dig into the area, the type of company. There may be a range realistically. Like if you're getting started, you might just say like, I really like to work in startups, but I don't know if it's like a big one or a small one. And that's going to depend to some extent on your skill, because it's going to be very hard for you to be like the first developer at a new startup if you don't really have a grasp on how to build like a whole set of things, because really you're responsible for building everything. And I've been that person before, so if you don't know what you're doing, it's a little bit dangerous. So, and that's, that can be a learning experience. You don't have to know everything in the world to take on that sort of thing, but you do need to be pretty skilled. So, maybe a later stage startup where you can come in as a true junior developer is more realistic. So again, like you just kind of have to look at everything and evaluate the situation that you're in and where you would feel comfortable working and this sort of thing, and then look at like what are the commonplace things in that domain. So back to the JavaScript thing earlier, I know I'm getting a little bit long-winded about this, but I think in the startup space, React is becoming sort of very commonplace. So, if you want to work in startups and you want to learn JavaScript, you're probably going to need to learn React or Vue.js, I think is another one. I mean, there's a handful of popular ones, but you're going to need to deal with that. So at any rate, I mean, I think, again, like focus on making stuff first. I think that's key, because like that's going to keep you going through anything else, because and I'm going to wrap up with this point, but there's this dynamic where people are like, I have to know React.js. And so you go learn React.js, but you don't know anything else, so you don't know how that fits into the big picture. And I'm a big fan of being able to build, like, I'm not saying you have to be a full stack developer, but you should at least know like the basics of full stack development if you're going to work in web application development, for example, so that you actually understand, like, if you go build a Rails app, for example, and then you build a front end in React because you need to learn that, that's a very useful thing because now you see how the whole picture fits together. You understand, like, oh, this is the JSON that I'm getting from the back end is generated like this, and it's just good to have that full picture. It's a little bit like, you go to get a school or go to school to get an engineering degree. You're going to learn like a whole bunch of stuff that you're not necessarily going to use every day. And then if you go get like a master's or a PhD, you're going to specialize. That's kind of how I see this. I think to work in web development, you need to understand how the web works, which is, a really useful thing. And then you can specialize later if you want, or you could just be like a full stack developer or however you want to look at that. I don't work as much in like data science or game development, so I can't give you like super deep examples there, but I think it's kind of the same idea. It's like, I guess in data science, you might think like, well, I could specialize in like financial trading, artificial intelligence or something like that. Well, you're going to need to understand like statistics first, so that's kind of the point. And it's a little bit of a long-winded point, but I think it's still relevant. It's just, whatever you're going to do, you need to look at it holistically. So to wrap things up, number one, what do you want to make? Number two, how easy is it to get started with that particular language? And number three, what kind of context do you want to work in? Start with number one, then go to number two, then go to number three. I think that's the right flow. That's my opinion. I want to know from you in the comments two things. I want to know, what do you think about all of this? Like, do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know. Second thing is, I want to know, what language are you starting with? That's what I want to know, and I want you to leave that in the comments. If you like this video, please subscribe and hit the bell button, and I'll talk to you next time.